The gleaming glass towers of Manhattan stretched endlessly into the gray October sky, each window reflecting the ambitions and dreams of those who dared to climb higher. On the 42nd floor of the prestigious Meridian International Building, Robert Blackstone adjusted his $1,000 Italian silk tie and gazed out at the city he had conquered. At 55, he was everything the world expected a billionaire to be: sharp-suited, silver-haired, and ruthlessly successful. His pharmaceutical empire, Blackstone Industries, had made him one of the most powerful men in America, with factories spanning 3 continents and a fortune that could buy small countries. But power, as Robert had learned over the decades, came with its own unique set of problems. Today was supposed to be the culmination of his greatest achievement yet: a groundbreaking partnership with 3 major international pharmaceutical companies from Japan, Germany, and Brazil. The deal would revolutionize cancer treatment worldwide and cement his legacy as more than just another wealthy businessman. It would make him a savior, a man who had literally bought hope for millions of suffering patients. The contracts were worth $8 billion, and more importantly, they represented a chance to distribute life-saving medications to the poorest corners of the world at cost price. As Robert paced his mahogany-paneled office, reviewing the final documents one last time, his assistant Maria burst through the door with an expression that made his blood run cold. Her usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the panic beneath. "Mr. Blackstone," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have a massive problem. The biggest problem we've ever faced." Robert set down his Mont Blanc pen and turned to face her, his jaw tightening with the kind of controlled tension that had intimidated boardrooms for decades. "What kind of problem, Maria? The kind we can solve with money, or the kind that destroys empires?" Maria's hands trembled as she clutched her tablet. "Sir, our entire translation team. They're stuck at JFK Airport. There was a massive system failure, some kind of cyber attack on the air traffic control systems. All international flights are grounded indefinitely. Dr. Yamamoto from Tokyo, Herr Mueller from Berlin, and Senor Santos from Sao Paulo, they're all here, waiting in the conference room. They've flown halfway around the world for this meeting, and none of them speak fluent English. Dr. Yamamoto only speaks Japanese and broken German. Herr Mueller insists on conducting business in German. And Senor Santos, he refuses to sign anything unless it's explained to him in Portuguese. They're getting frustrated, sir. Dr. Yamamoto has already mentioned that he has other offers from our competitors." The weight of the situation crashed down on Robert like a collapsing building. 3 years of negotiations, countless sleepless nights, millions spent on legal fees and research, all hanging by a thread because of something as simple as language barriers. He had built his empire on the principle that every problem had a solution if you threw enough resources at it. But this was different. Time was slipping away like sand through his fingers, and with each passing minute, the most important deal of his life was crumbling into dust. "Give me every translator in New York City," Robert commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to moving mountains. "I don't care what it costs. Charter helicopters if you have to. Call the UN, call the embassies, call language schools. Find me native speakers of Japanese, German, and Portuguese who can handle complex pharmaceutical terminology, and find them now." But even as he spoke the words, Robert could see the futility reflected in Maria's eyes. The cyber attack had crippled the city's transportation systems. The translators they needed were either stuck in traffic that stretched for miles or trapped in airports across the tri-state area. In the conference room, 3 floors below, 3 of the world's most influential pharmaceutical executives sat in uncomfortable silence, checking their watches and exchanging worried glances. The future of global healthcare hung in the balance, and Robert Blackstone, the man who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome, found himself facing the most humbling defeat of his extraordinary career. 2 hours had passed since the crisis began, and the situation had deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. Robert stood at the head of the conference table, his usually perfect appearance now showing signs of stress. His tie hung slightly loose. His silver hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and dark circles had begun to form under his steel-gray eyes. The three pharmaceutical executives sat before him like judges at a tribunal, their patience wearing thinner with each failed attempt at communication. Dr. Yamamoto, a distinguished man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, kept glancing at his phone and muttering in rapid Japanese. Herr Mueller, a stern-faced German with penetrating blue eyes, drummed his fingers impatiently on the polished conference table. Senor Santos, a charismatic Brazilian with salt and pepper hair, had already stood up twice, threatening to leave for the airport. The language barrier had transformed what should have been a triumphant moment into a nightmare of miscommunication and mounting frustration. Robert had tried everything his wealth and influence could buy. He had offered Dr. Yamamoto's assistant, who spoke broken English, $100,000 to translate, but the young man was terrified of making mistakes with such complex pharmaceutical terminology. He had attempted to use online translation apps, but the technical jargon about molecular structures and clinical trial protocols was too sophisticated for digital tools. The results were laughably inaccurate and sometimes dangerously misleading. He had even tried to conduct the meeting through gestures and crude drawings, but explaining cancer treatment mechanisms through charades was not only impossible, but deeply insulting to the brilliant minds seated around the table. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was that Robert could see the genuine excitement in their eyes whenever they managed to communicate successfully. Dr. Yamamoto's face would light up when he understood a concept, his passion for helping cancer patients shining through despite the language barriers. Herr Mueller would nod vigorously when he grasped a particularly innovative aspect of the treatment, his scientific curiosity overcoming his stern demeanor. Senor Santos would lean forward eagerly whenever they found common ground, his enthusiasm for bringing affordable medicine to Brazil's underserved communities evident in every gesture. These weren't just business partners. They were fellow warriors in the fight against one of humanity's greatest enemies. They shared the same dream, the same noble purpose, but they were trapped on opposite sides of an invisible wall built from different languages and cultural nuances. The clock on the conference room wall seemed to tick louder with each passing minute, counting down to the moment when opportunity would slip away forever. Dr. Yamamoto had received 3 phone calls from competitors in the past hour, each offer more tempting than the last. Herr Mueller's pharmaceutical company had shareholders breathing down his neck, demanding immediate answers about the partnership. Senor Santos had a board meeting scheduled in Sao Paulo the next morning, and his flight was already delayed by several hours. The weight of impending failure pressed down on Robert's shoulders like a crushing burden, heavier than anything he had ever experienced in his decades of high-stakes business dealings. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference room, Robert found himself questioning everything he had built. What good was all his money if he couldn't bridge a simple communication gap? What value did his empire have if it crumbled at the first real obstacle? He thought about the millions of cancer patients around the world who were counting on innovations that might never see the light of day because of this disaster. He imagined children in hospital beds, parents holding their hands, doctors delivering devastating diagnoses that could have been prevented if only he could make these brilliant minds understand each other. The human cost of his failure was staggering, and for the first time in his life, Robert Blackstone felt truly powerless. Maria continued to field phone calls from desperate translation services, each conversation ending in disappointment. The cyber attack had created a perfect storm of circumstances that seemed designed to destroy everything Robert had worked for. Outside the windows, the city continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the drama unfolding 42 floors above the street. Somewhere in those concrete canyons, there had to be someone who could help, but time was running out, and hope was fading faster than the October daylight. Just as Dr. Yamamoto was reaching for his briefcase with an expression of finality, the conference room door opened with a soft click that somehow managed to cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned to see a woman in her early 40s entering quietly, pushing a cleaning cart laden with supplies. She wore the simple navy blue uniform of the building's janitorial staff, her graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her weathered hands spoke of years of honest, hard work. What struck Robert immediately was not her humble appearance, but the way she moved through the room with a quiet dignity that seemed to calm the chaos around her. Her name tag read Elena, and she offered a small, apologetic smile as she began to empty the wastebaskets with practiced efficiency. Robert barely glanced at her initially, his mind still racing through impossible solutions and his heart sinking deeper into despair. He had grown so accustomed to being surrounded by people in expensive suits and luxury cars that the working class had become nearly invisible to him, part of the background machinery that kept his world functioning smoothly. But as Elena worked, something extraordinary began to happen. Dr. Yamamoto, frustrated by another failed attempt to explain a complex molecular formula, had muttered something in Japanese under his breath. To everyone's amazement, Elena paused in her work and responded in fluent Japanese, her pronunciation perfect and her tone respectful yet confident. The room fell into stunned silence. Dr. Yamamoto's eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and he sat up straighter in his chair, as if he had just witnessed a miracle. He spoke again in Japanese, this time more deliberately, testing whether he had imagined the impossible. Elena set down her cleaning supplies and replied with ease, her words flowing like music in the suddenly electric atmosphere. She was explaining that she had overheard his concern about the photodynamic therapy protocols and wondered if she might be of assistance with translation. Dr. Yamamoto's face transformed from frustration to wonder, and he began speaking rapidly in Japanese, his excitement building with each sentence. Robert stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, watching this incredible scene unfold before his eyes. Here was his salvation, dressed in a janitor's uniform and carrying a mop bucket, speaking perfect Japanese to one of the world's most renowned pharmaceutical researchers. But Elena wasn't finished surprising them. When Herr Mueller began protesting in German that he couldn't understand what was being discussed, Elena turned to him and responded in flawless German, her accent suggesting she might have spent years in Berlin or Vienna. The stern German executive's jaw dropped, and for the first time since the meeting began, he smiled genuinely. Senor Santos, not to be outdone, began speaking rapidly in Portuguese, testing whether this miraculous cleaning lady could possibly speak his language as well. Elena's response came without hesitation, her Portuguese carrying the warm rhythms of Brazil, complete with regional expressions that made Santos laugh with delight and clap his hands together. She had just greeted him using a phrase specific to Sao Paulo, asking about his family in a way that suggested deep cultural understanding rather than textbook learning. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and profound. The three executives, who had been on the verge of walking away from the deal of a lifetime, were now leaning forward eagerly, their eyes bright with possibility. Elena stood in the center of it all, still holding her cleaning cloth, looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention, but ready to help. Robert felt his legs go weak as the full magnitude of what was happening sank in. His empire, his legacy, the future of cancer treatment for millions of people around the world, might all depend on a woman whose existence he had never even acknowledged before today. Elena looked around the room, taking in the expensive suits, the piles of legal documents, the obvious tension that had been suffocating everyone present. Her voice was gentle but clear as she spoke in English, addressing Robert directly for the first time. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice that you gentlemen seem to be having some communication difficulties. I've been cleaning offices in this building for 15 years, and I've picked up quite a bit about pharmaceutical research from listening to meetings. If you need someone to help translate, I'd be honored to assist, though I understand if you prefer to wait for professional translators." Her words were carefully chosen, respectful yet confident, spoken by someone who understood her place in the world but was not diminished by it. The silence that followed Elena's offer stretched for what felt like an eternity, heavy with disbelief and the weight of desperate hope. Robert stared at her, as if she were an apparition, his mind struggling to process the impossibility of the situation. Here stood a woman he had passed in hallways countless times without a second glance, a person whose name he had never bothered to learn despite 15 years of shared proximity, and she was offering to save everything he had worked for. The irony was so profound it felt like a cosmic joke, yet the sincerity in her dark eyes told him she was completely serious. Dr. Yamamoto was the first to break the spell, speaking rapidly in Japanese directly to Elena. His words tumbled out in an excited stream, and Robert watched in fascination as Elena listened intently, nodding occasionally and asking clarifying questions with the precision of a trained professional. When Dr. Yamamoto finished, Elena turned to the group and began translating with remarkable fluency. Dr. Yamamoto is explaining that his research team in Tokyo has developed a new method for delivering targeted chemotherapy using nanotechnology. The treatment can identify cancer cells with 94% accuracy and deliver medication directly to tumors, while leaving healthy tissue completely untouched. He says the preliminary trials in Japan have shown remission rates that exceed anything currently available in Western medicine. The room erupted with excitement as Mueller immediately began peppering Elena with questions in rapid German, his earlier skepticism replaced by scientific curiosity. Elena translated seamlessly, switching between languages with the grace of a conductor leading an orchestra. Mueller wants to know about the long-term effects and whether the nanotechnology can be adapted for different types of cancer. He's particularly interested in pediatric applications because his company has been struggling to develop treatments safe enough for children. The conversation that had been impossible just minutes earlier was now flowing like a river that had suddenly found its course. Senor Santos leaned forward eagerly, his eyes bright with possibility, as he spoke in Portuguese about Brazil's unique challenges with cancer treatment in remote areas. Elena's translation revealed the heart of a man who had dedicated his career to bringing hope to the forgotten corners of the world. Senor Santos explains that in Brazil, many cancer patients die not from the disease itself, but from lack of access to treatment. His distribution network can reach villages where people have never seen a doctor, let alone receive modern cancer therapy. He's willing to subsidize treatments for the poorest patients if the partnership can guarantee supply chains that won't be disrupted by political or economic instability. As Elena facilitated this miraculous three-way conversation, Robert found himself studying her with new eyes. Her translations weren't just linguistically accurate. They captured the emotional nuances and cultural context that were essential for true understanding. When Dr. Yamamoto expressed concern about potential cultural barriers to treatment acceptance in conservative communities, Elena didn't just translate his words, but explained the deeper cultural implications that would affect implementation. When Mueller mentioned regulatory hurdles in the European Union, she provided context about similar issues the executives might face in their respective countries. Her knowledge of pharmaceutical terminology was encyclopedic, and her understanding of international business protocols was remarkable. But what struck Robert most profoundly was the way Elena interacted with the three executives. Despite the vast differences in their social and economic status, she treated them as equals, engaging with their ideas intellectually and challenging their assumptions when necessary. When Senor Santos proposed a pricing structure that seemed overly optimistic, Elena gently questioned the mathematics in Portuguese, helping him refine his proposal before translating it to the others. When Dr. Yamamoto made a cultural assumption about American patients that might have offended Robert, Elena diplomatically reframed the comment to preserve dignity while maintaining accuracy. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was nothing short of miraculous. Where there had been frustration and despair, there was now animated discussion and growing excitement. The three executives were discovering that their individual innovations, when combined, could create something revolutionary beyond any of their individual capabilities. Dr. Yamamoto's nanotechnology, Mueller's delivery systems, and Senor Santos's distribution network formed a perfect triangle of innovation that could reshape cancer treatment globally. As the conversation deepened and the technical details became more complex, Robert realized that Elena wasn't just translating words. She was building bridges between minds, cultures, and dreams. She was making possible what his billions of dollars and decades of experience had failed to achieve. The cleaning cart stood forgotten in the corner, a symbol of how completely the world had shifted in the span of 30 minutes. Elena had transformed from an invisible service worker into the most important person in the room, and Robert was beginning to understand that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. 2 hours later, the conference room had been transformed into a hub of international collaboration that would have been impossible without Elena's extraordinary intervention. Legal documents were being revised in real time, with Elena seamlessly translating complex pharmaceutical patents and regulatory requirements between 3 languages. The executives had moved from skeptical strangers to enthusiastic partners, their mutual respect growing with each successfully communicated idea. Robert sat at the head of the table, ostensibly leading the meeting, but increasingly aware that Elena had become the true conductor of this symphony of minds. As the evening approached and the deal's framework solidified, Robert found himself studying Elena with a mixture of admiration and profound curiosity. During a brief break in negotiations, while the executives made phone calls to their respective boards of directors, he approached her quietly. "Elena," he said, her name feeling strange on his tongue after 15 years of never speaking it. "I have to ask, how is this possible? How does a janitor speak 3 languages fluently and understand pharmaceutical terminology better than some of my own executives?" Elena's smile was gentle but tinged with sadness, as if his question had opened an old wound that had never properly healed. She set down the water glass she had been refilling and looked directly into his eyes, her gaze steady and unafraid. "Mr. Blackstone, I wasn't always a janitor. 20 years ago, I was Dr. Elena Vasquez, head of international relations for Santos Pharmaceutical in Sao Paulo. I had a PhD in biochemical engineering from the University of Sao Paulo and spoke 6 languages fluently. I was married to a wonderful man named Carlos, and we had 2 beautiful children, Miguel and Sofia." The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow, and he found himself reaching for the back of a chair to steady himself. Dr. Elena Vasquez. The name stirred a distant memory from his early days in the pharmaceutical industry, whispers of a brilliant Brazilian researcher who had disappeared from the international scene decades ago. "What happened?" he asked quietly, though he already sensed that the answer would be painful. Elena's voice remained steady, but Robert could see the grief flickering in her eyes like old flames that refused to die completely. In 2004, there was a corporate scandal at Santos Pharmaceutical. Someone had been embezzling research funds and falsifying clinical trial data. The evidence pointed to several high-level executives, including my husband Carlos, who was the chief financial officer. I tried to investigate internally, to find the truth and protect the company I loved, but I made a terrible mistake. I trusted the wrong person with my concerns, someone I thought was my friend and ally. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing, her words measured and careful. That person was actually the one orchestrating the fraud, and when I got too close to the truth, they destroyed all the evidence and made it look like Carlos and I were the masterminds behind everything. We were arrested, our assets were frozen, and the media painted us as greedy executives who had stolen money meant for life-saving research. Carlos couldn't handle the shame and the stress. He had a heart attack in prison while waiting for trial. He died believing that I thought he was guilty, because in my desperation to prove our innocence, I had said things, terrible things that I can never take back. Robert felt his heart breaking as he listened to her story, understanding now why she had looked at him with such knowing sadness when he was drowning in his earlier despair. The charges were eventually dropped when the real culprit fled to Switzerland with millions of dollars, but by then it was too late. Carlos was gone, my children were so traumatized they could barely look at me, and my professional reputation was destroyed. No pharmaceutical company would hire me, not even as a lab technician. The scandal had made international news, and my name was forever associated with corporate fraud and scientific misconduct. Elena's voice grew softer, but somehow stronger, as she continued her devastating tale. "I lost everything, Mr. Blackstone. My career, my husband, my children's respect, my home, my country. I came to New York with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few $100s I had managed to hide from the asset seizure. I was 52 years old, starting over in a country where my degrees meant nothing and my reputation preceded me like a scarlet letter. The only job I could find was cleaning offices, and I was grateful for it because it meant I could survive. The weight of her words settled over Robert like a heavy blanket, and he realized that he was looking at someone who had experienced a fall from grace that made his current crisis seem trivial by comparison. Here was a woman who had lost everything that mattered to her, yet she had maintained her dignity, her knowledge, and her willingness to help others. The irony was staggering. The person who had just saved his empire was someone whose empire had been destroyed by the very industry they both served. The revelation of Elena's true identity sent shockwaves through Robert's understanding of everything he thought he knew about success, failure, and human worth. As he stood there processing her story, the three international executives returned from their phone calls, their faces bright with excitement and approval from their respective boards. They had no idea that their translator was actually one of the most brilliant minds in pharmaceutical research, a woman whose fall from grace had been as spectacular as Robert's current rise to power. The contrast was almost too painful to contemplate. Dr. Yamamoto was practically vibrating with enthusiasm as he spoke rapidly in Japanese, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. Elena translated with her usual precision, but Robert noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. There was a distant look in her eyes, as if she were remembering what it felt like to be on the other side of such conversations, when she was the one making groundbreaking announcements instead of simply translating them for others. Dr. Yamamoto says that his board in Tokyo has given unanimous approval for the partnership. They're prepared to commit $2 billion to the joint research initiative and can have the first nanotechnology prototypes ready for clinical trials within 6 months. Herr Mueller's response was equally enthusiastic, his stern features softened by genuine excitement as he spoke in rapid German about regulatory approvals and European distribution networks. Elena's translation revealed the scope of his commitment: advanced manufacturing facilities, expedited approval processes, and a distribution network that could reach every major hospital in Europe within 2 years. But as she translated his words, Robert caught a fleeting expression of profound sadness crossing her face. Gone so quickly, he might have imagined it if he hadn't been watching her so intently. Senor Santos was practically dancing with joy as he explained in Portuguese how the partnership would revolutionize healthcare in South America. His commitment was staggering: $1 billion investment in manufacturing facilities, a promise to provide treatments at cost to the poorest communities, and a distribution network that could reach remote villages that had never seen modern medicine. Elena translated his passionate speech about bringing hope to the forgotten corners of the world, and Robert realized that this was exactly the kind of work she had dedicated her life to before everything fell apart. As the evening wore on and the contract details were finalized, Robert found himself watching Elena with new eyes. Every technical term she translated perfectly, every cultural nuance she navigated skillfully, every diplomatic solution she provided for potential conflicts. All of it spoke to a depth of experience and expertise that went far beyond what any professional translator could offer. She wasn't just facilitating a business deal. She was orchestrating the creation of something that could save millions of lives. And she was doing it all while dressed in a janitor's uniform, invisible to everyone except the man whose empire she had just saved. The final signatures were placed on the contracts at 9:47 p.m., witnessed by handshakes and champagne toasts that marked the beginning of what would likely become the most significant pharmaceutical partnership in history. $8 billion in combined investments, revolutionary technology that could change cancer treatment forever, and a distribution network that would bring hope to the darkest corners of the world. Dr. Yamamoto, Herr Mueller, and Senor Santos were ecstatic, their earlier frustrations forgotten in the glow of unprecedented success. But as the executives prepared to leave, gathering their copies of the signed agreements and making plans for implementation meetings, Robert noticed that Elena had quietly begun cleaning up the conference room. She was emptying ashtrays and straightening chairs as if this had been just another ordinary day, as if she hadn't just facilitated the deal of the century. The three international executives thanked her profusely in their respective languages, their gratitude genuine and heartfelt, but none of them truly understood what she had sacrificed to be in this position. Dr. Yamamoto bowed deeply to Elena in the traditional Japanese manner, speaking words of profound respect and gratitude. Herr Mueller shook her hand with the formal dignity of a German businessman, but his eyes conveyed genuine admiration for her skill and professionalism. Senora Santos, in the warm Brazilian tradition, embraced her gently and spoke words in Portuguese that brought tears to her eyes, something about how proud her family would be of what she had accomplished tonight. As the executives left the building, their voices echoing with excitement about the future they would build together, Robert remained in the conference room with Elena. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of revelations that had changed everything. Elena continued cleaning methodically, as if maintaining normalcy could somehow protect her from the emotional intensity of what had just occurred. But Robert could see the tremor in her hands as she wiped down the conference table where history had been made, and he knew that this night had been as transformative for her as it had been for him. The clock on the conference room wall showed 10:15 p.m. when Robert finally found the courage to break the silence that had stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Elena was carefully arranging the chairs around the table, her movements precise and practiced, but he could see the exhaustion in her shoulders and the weight of memory in her posture. "Elena," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority that usually commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors. "What you did tonight, what you've been doing for 15 years. I don't have words adequate enough to express my gratitude or my shame." Elena paused in her cleaning, her hands resting on the back of a chair where Dr. Yamamoto had sat just hours earlier, celebrating a partnership that would save countless lives. When she looked up at Robert, her eyes held a complexity of emotion that spoke to decades of hidden pain and unexpected grace. "Mr. Blackstone, you don't owe me anything. I was simply doing what I could to help, the same as I do every day when I clean these offices and listen to the brilliant minds working to make the world better. Tonight was just more visible than usual." But Robert shook his head, his silver hair catching the soft light from the conference room chandelier. "No, Elena. Dr. Vasquez, what you did tonight wasn't just helping, it was miraculous. And what I did for 15 years was inexcusable. I walked past you thousands of times, treated you as invisible, never once considering that you might have dreams, intelligence, a story worth knowing. I built an empire on the foundation of pharmaceutical innovation, yet I failed to recognize the most innovative mind in my own building." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of recognition that had come far too late. Elena's smile was gentle but tinged with the wisdom that comes only from surviving profound loss. "Robert," she said, using his first name for the first time, "the pharmaceutical industry taught me that brilliance without humility is worthless, and that success without compassion is hollow. Tonight, you learned something that took me 20 years and the loss of everything I held dear to understand. Sometimes the most important knowledge comes from the most unexpected teachers." Robert moved closer, his expensive shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. "Elena, I want to offer you something, but I'm afraid it will sound inadequate after what you've given me. I want to offer you a position, not just any position, but head of international relations for Blackstone Industries. Your salary would be more than you could spend in several lifetimes. You'd have a team of researchers at your disposal, and you'd be working directly with the partnerships you helped create tonight. You'd be back where you belong, at the forefront of pharmaceutical innovation." Elena's response surprised him with its immediate gentleness. "Robert, your offer is incredibly generous, and it comes from a good heart that I'm only now beginning to see. But I learned something in these 15 years of cleaning offices that I never learned in all my years as Dr. Vasquez. I learned that dignity doesn't come from titles or salaries or recognition. It comes from knowing that you've done your best with whatever circumstances life has given you. I found peace in my work here, strange as that might sound to someone like you." She moved to the window, looking out at the glittering lights of Manhattan stretching endlessly into the night. "But," she continued, her voice carrying a note of possibility that made Robert's heart leap, "there is something you could do that would mean more to me than any position or salary you could offer. In Brazil, there are still children dying from cancers that your new partnership could cure. There are villages where my former colleagues at Santos Pharmaceuticals still work, trying to bring medicine to people who have nothing. If you could ensure that this revolutionary treatment reaches those forgotten places, if you could make sure that wealth doesn't determine who lives and who dies, that would be a gift beyond measure. Robert felt tears stinging his eyes as he understood the true magnitude of what Elena was asking. She wasn't seeking personal redemption or financial reward. She was asking him to use his newfound success to fulfill the dream that had been stolen from her 20 years ago. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I promise you that the first treatments will go to the places where they're needed most, not where they'll be most profitable. And I want you to oversee that distribution personally, not as my employee, but as my partner." Dr. Elena Vasquez deserves to see her life's work finally reach the people she always meant to help. As Elena turned from the window, Robert saw something in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror in moments of unexpected grace. The look of someone whose deepest wounds were finally beginning to heal. The janitor's uniform she wore seemed somehow transformed, no longer a symbol of defeat, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Tomorrow, the world would celebrate Robert Blackstone's greatest business triumph. But tonight, in the quiet dignity of this conference room, two souls had found something more valuable than success. They had found redemption, understanding, and the courage to transform pain into purpose. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued its relentless dance of ambition and dreams. But inside this room, two people had discovered that sometimes the most profound victories come not from reaching the top, but from learning to see the extraordinary in the invisible and finding the strength to lift others as we climb.